This is Worldview, and thank you for joining us. I'm Yvonne Katsande. Now, in today's topic, we look at women in a deeper perspective. There is the truth in the notion that the struggle for the emancipation of women has come a long way over the centuries. And history tells us that women in the past have been relegated to the background. They were mostly found in the kitchen and other absurd places. For instance, modeling pictures in the 1970s seems to portray women as perfect in the kitchen and also the home as a place where they found their fulfillment. To get a clear view, let's look at the history of women around the globe. Starting in Africa, the situation was one that boys were more cherished as compared to their female counterparts. Females were seen as people who needed to learn about how to keep a family and to maintain a home. They were also seen as main instruments for procreation. Men were seen as the head of the family. Females had to comply with whatever decision the man came up with. A man was mostly measured by the number of women he had. Now, women in Africa were seen as just a mere collection in a gallery. And now in Europe, the position of females depended on how whiter or how beautiful she was. Beautiful women were given a lot of attention. This can even be seen from fairy tales like Cinderella, Snow White, and just to mention but a few. Also, females were valued based on the position the parents held. In Africa, the heroic stories of females like Yaha Asentawa changed the mentality of women. They saw themselves to be as equal as the males and then began to unleash themselves from the shackle they had been forced into. Also, the myth, it is a waste of time to educate a female child, began to dwindle. More ladies were enrolled in school. This led to a decrease in the birth rate. Ladies began to own property. In Europe, females began to agitate for equality. More laws were passed in order to enable women work in bigger firms and jobs. Initiatives like maternity leave gave women the chance for them to leave work so as to give birth. Now, as we celebrate World Literacy Day and the value of women in society, we look at matters arising. Joining me in studio is Nsiki Sisulu Singapi. She is the Chief Director of the Social Development and Department of Women in South Africa. Good evening and thank you for joining us.
Good evening and thank you for having me.
I know very well that you represent women fully, not only in South Africa, but in Africa as a whole. Now, the women of the 21st century has declared that she wants to be viewed as an equal to the man. And I may argue this notion of 50-50 as being limiting and shortchanging to the women's struggle going forward. What is your take on that?
Thank you. I think that it's important that we perhaps question the women of the 21st century because it presupposes that men are the standard. And if we want to be equal to them, it means they then set the bar. But I don't think that they're baseline. But the only reason that we talk for or advocate for 50-50, which is gender parity, is because women make up the majority of the population in most countries, and certainly the case in South Africa. And therefore it goes to reason then that you have a balanced approach to society. So it's what we call that we want to move towards a gender equal society. So we're equal in terms of access, in terms of opportunities, but not necessarily equal because the men have set the standard.
Okay, so men receive this easily because I know this has always been a debate. Even last week as I was doing my research, the debate of 50-50 still does not settle well with the male counterpart. Okay, now moving on. As emerging economies such as the BRICS, that is Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa countries, grow in political and economic influence, how well have women's rights kept pace with these developments?
Okay, it's important that when you're working on multilateral level with other countries, that you take into consideration that you come from different positions in terms of what you'd want to have. For example, in countries like China, they may not necessarily have a 50-50 gender parity principle that we have in South Africa. And even in South Africa, we've moved from a 30% to a 50% given the progress that we've made, and thus we regard it as a best practice in most countries. And so as we move into the space of multilateral diplomacy, if you will, which of course would be the BRICS countries, you'd find that we have to negotiate a little bit differently, but a little bit more, because it is not necessarily that everybody has the same gender policy or principles that they're adhering to.
But how have those other countries that obviously are different from our culture, how have they received that?
Generally, countries are open because, for example, most of the countries have signed on to the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women at the United Nations level. So we all come from a premise that says that we want to empower women. The pace at which we are empowering women, however, differs. So you'll find that as we negotiate, for example, the BRICS Bank, for example, where is it going to be, in which country is going to be, so that makes a part of the. But also the question is, what percentage of empowerment or economic participation are women going to be allowed to have? So because society is generally patriarchal in nature, sharing that space becomes somewhat difficult. You'll see also that in South Africa, when we looked at over the 20 years, just in a domestic context, that we find that women are more of the ones who are unemployed. There are more women who are poverty-stricken. There are more women who are unequal, given the average. So women are gender equality or women empowerment and gender equality, and a lot of debate still has to go into that. We are in September, and the heads of states will sit and make a final decision on the Sustainable Development Goals that are going into what we call the UN General Assembly. And so the perspective that we had really wanted in terms of gender is not to categorize what would be gender issues and have a standalone goal only, but actually to do what we call mainstreaming. You have to mainstream issues of gender in all the goals. So if you're talking about education or health, safety, security, all those issues, women are affected, and they're affected differently from men. And if you look at it globally, you know that issues of gender-based violence continue to be a challenge. And so those issues, if you're looking at safety and security, how violence affects women would be different than how it would affect men. So at a global level, of course, there is a great advocacy work that's happening around advocating for one standalone goal where all countries will be measured against this particular goal and the respective indicators. But there's still also an advocacy that says all the goals need to actually take a gender perspective into account.
Okay, you touched a bit there on gender-based violence, particularly looking at South Africa at this point in time. I remember we had such an increase in gender-based violence and rape and killings against women, even children at some point. Remembering one of the teenage girls that was murdered, raped in such I don't know, a crazy way, stomach-turning way that left the country reeling in pain. At that point in time, survey had it that the rape rate was literally 4 minutes. After every 4 minutes, there was a woman being raped. How are the stats as we speak?
It's a very important question because this, when research is conducted, it's always conducted from a particular perspective by a particular group for a particular purpose. And as a country, we are actually working on, together with social development, working on a government program of action to actually begin to mediate what is currently happening at the moment, but also looking long term and saying, what is it that we need to do to prevent violence against women and children? And what is it that we need to do to actually respond, which is the response issue that we're really dealing with all the time, what you're hearing. And then, of course, we need to also take into account issues of care and support. So the statistics as they stand right now, none of which can be said to be official statistics, but they're statistics that will be provided by a particular organization at a particular time. It's the same issue as results that may have been released by the MRC, for example, the Medical Research Council, on the issue of intimate partner violence, that most women are killed by their intimate partners. Of course, so you'd have to obviously look at which community was done, how broad is it, can that research be generalized? So the issue of statistics are always problematic to actually see if you can scale them up to say in the country, therefore, you have the statistic that you mentioned, which was a civil society organization that had conducted that particular research. So we are a bit wary around giving the number of statistics or giving the statistics as they stand, because you have to actually desegregate your data into not only the age of the girls or the age of the women, but also the type of violation that has happened. But you also need to bring in a multi-sectoral approach where when I come into a health facility having been abused, that if I'm cut, they don't treat it only as a medical condition, but they begin to actually cost what the cost of gender-based violence is, because my injuries would have been sustained due to a partner or intimate partner violence. So there's a lot that needs to go into how we arrive at a point of saying these are the statistics. And sometimes people who present at a medical facility do not necessarily make make it into the statistics. Those who present at a police station are more likely to make it into the statistics. And of course, you'll have a whole debate around, you know, the validity of the statistics that are presented by government, whether government is or is not presenting what civil society would deem the actual statistics. But in terms of an official position, we are working on ensuring that we can coordinate and consolidate the work that has been done by various sectors of society to come up with what our baseline is in terms of gender-based violence in the country.
Okay, now, most of you would agree with me that even currently, though, black and white women may be living on the same political landscape. They, however, have distinctly different cultural realities. I make this race distinction because the white women in South Africa have their cultural heritage rooted in the political advancement of Europe, if I may say, which at the time of the arrival of white people to settle in South Africa was somewhat ahead than that of a black woman in this country. Now, does this put the black woman at a disadvantage, or perhaps have things balanced out with time? Okay.
It's a very interesting question in that when you say arrival of white women would have put women black women at a disadvantage, we have to take the context, the point that they found black women here. And when the struggle for emancipation of women in South Africa took place, it did not take into account the issue of race or creed. It said all women, because women were not allowed to vote, whether you were black or you were white. Women were minors in South Africa. If you were married, you became a minor, like your child would be a minor in your house. You became a minor to your husband. And it was without regard. It was for black women and for white women.
And even the living conditions were equal at the time?
The living conditions would be, as we went into the struggle for that which we want to transform legislation, the living conditions would be different. However, you must recognize that if you bring colonization into a context of Africa, you then begin to say colonization and what you would say civilization is better than the culture and the African cultures that they found here. And that, I think, is a misnomer. And that's where you find that discrimination starts. Is that because I come from Europe, therefore I am better than what I find here. But what South African women were striving for was an issue of equality for women as a whole. Now the living conditions change because as colonization happens and as apartheid sets in and takes root, is that women then are relegated to be domestic workers in white families, in white households. And that's where the discrepancy comes. It's not that the struggle for women, for white women, for black women was different. It's that the struggle that we went through in South Africa was one that sought for and fought for non-racialism. Unfortunately, it is the case that you will find that women are domestic workers in households of white women. And so that would obviously change. But that came with the issue of discrimination and oppression, which we fought for up until 1994.
Now, during the era of the 21st century women, which I keep referring to as the 21st century women, there has been skyrocketing rate of divorce. Marital instability is evidenced by high divorce rates in the 1990s and the 2000s have motivated many women to either stay single, give birth out of wedlock, or opt for adoption. Now, was this the expected model of a woman, of a free woman, when you were advocating for women? Was this the ideal?
Neither marriage nor singlehood was said to be the ideal. And because you've come from a question around issues of culture, the culture and the religious background from which people come will determine how they choose to bear children. But at a constitutional level, our constitution allows for women's rights in terms of reproductive health and rights. That says you can have your children as and when you choose to have your children, how you choose to have your children. And that no man necessarily can dictate to you to say you will have them in this particular fashion. And of course, once you get into a household level, of course, you'll have your cultural and your religious, premise that decides and helps you, guides you, and does that. But at a constitutional and a country level, the issue was never about the model woman would be one that is married and has children in wedlock, nor was it one that was a woman would be single, nor was it one that a woman would then marry and divorce. But our rights, the rights that are enshrined in the Constitution, allow women to marry, and if they feel that perhaps for issues of violence they need to leave, then they would do that. Or for whatever other reasons they may feel they need to leave, they should be allowed to do that. And those rights have been enshrined in the Constitution to allow women not to be oppressed, not only by the system, but not even by their partners.
Okay, now that you've said that they have their rights and all that, but here's another thing. The economic impact of the divorce, especially on the non-working women, is also often disastrous, if I must say. They're not working, they don't have an income. It somehow then affects the child support, which is not always forthcoming in most cases. Hence, we have people relying on the government to give them support when they have kids. Most previous non-working women enter the labour market following a divorce. Is this still not exploitation of a woman?
Oh, I suppose it would be by whom? If she is choosing to leave the marriage for reasons known to her, and each case would have to be taken on merit. A number of reasons that people would cite: issues of staying in a marriage because they are financially dependent, although the marriage is either physically or emotionally abusive. And of course, the end result of some of that is that somebody ends up dead because they didn't get divorced, or they didn't leave the relationship. Even for people who are not necessarily married, didn't leave a relationship because they're financially dependent. But also, what does it do in a relationship when you stay because of financial dependence on someone, and yet you're terribly unhappy? And what kind of a family environment do you create for the children that may or may not be in that particular environment? So a lot of factors must be taken into account in terms of cultural, religious, but also the circumstances in which people find themselves that compel them to either leave or die. And so people have to make those kinds of decisions. Or also, am I only a financial entity here that I have to stay so that I can be financially viable? But the grants that the state is giving is a grant to ensure that people do not get into poverty, and begin to, for those who are in poverty, to begin to lift them up. It's so that you don't get to a point where there is nowhere to go. And it's such that people should not stay in it forever, and that's why you'll have other programs like the Public Works program, where it allows people to have temporary employment to allow them then to move on to permanent employment in other areas.
Okay, so how can social injustices be addressed?
Yeah. It's a societal issue. It is neither a government alone, nor a civil society or a religious sector issue only. Social injustices talks about an issue of societal transformation, which says we all have to change our mindset in how we view women. If we think women are less than, and women cannot be, for example, CEOs of companies. We only have less than 5% of women who are CEOs of companies in South Africa at the moment. And so when you have that reality, you then need to begin to then redirect that in terms of a mindset shift to say we are equals in accessing opportunities. But you must also know that women, even if you have access to opportunities, if you choose, and you talked about people being married and divorced, if you choose that you're going to be married, you're going to be a woman who bears children, you are going to be over a year or two, not necessarily have 4 months maternity leave and be interrupted in their career path. And so you become someone who's already behind simply because you've exercised your right to bear children. So there are those complexities that then means that you then become, and it's a social issue, is that you then become a caregiving mother, if you will, for 4 months, or you have to make a choice to be a career woman and continue with that. So a mindset shift is therefore required in order for that to happen. For example, in Japan, young women have chosen increasingly not to get married and actually marry much later in their 30s and above, because if you do get married, it means your career-wise, you are unable to you can't progress in your line of work. So the social ills are a collective issue, and I think that when you look at what the role civil society has to play, what role faith-based organizations have to play, and the role that government has to play, often government is looked at as the one who's supposed to solve the social ills that may face. Issues of access to water, issues of basic needs and sanitation, those are all social issues that have to bring on board the community community at its basic level. If a community, for example, sees a tap with water that's running and it's not closing, they can't just say, shrug their shoulders and say, but somebody's supposed to fix it. They need and take that inherent responsibility, because once you run short of water, then it's a crisis. You know, so that's why it needs all of us at a community level, and indeed at a civil society, more organized, organizational level, faith-based organization, and indeed government, to play a role in shifting the mindset to say we all have a collective responsibility in curbing the ills of a society, but also preventing them from continuing to happen.
Okay, now coming to this one interesting question. The Oscar Pistorius case, highly contested by women in South Africa. The trial has completely taken a different turn, especially after the announcement that Oscar Pistorius will not be leaving correctional services anytime soon until further notice. Of what significance is this case in particular to women?
I think within the South African jurisprudence, I think it becomes very, very important. And the women of South Africa, and again, you would see that it's not a race issue here, because the women who came out advocating for Oscar Pistorius not to be released was the Progressive Women's Movement, and I believe a civil society organization called Dream Team Foundation, who were women who were themselves incarcerated and spoke about how the rehabilitation happens in prison, and that in 10 months it is not possible that somebody would have been rehabilitated, nor would they have shown themselves remorseful enough to then be released. And thus the Minister, of course, of Correctional Service, Corrections and the Department of Justice
yes,
was able to then ask the parole board to then re-look at that issue. But this is a very good example of how civil society was the one who were the ones who advocated for Oscar Pistorius not to be released. And so it becomes a great example of how you can't just wait for government, nor can you wait for a community elsewhere, but that all of us have a role.
It's a collective
It's an absolutely collective duty for us to say, and because we're talking about, you know, the issues of intimate partner violence, it is a classic case of that, of how she was killed by her partner. And of course, Riva Steenkamp is no more. She cannot speak for herself. Those of us who are here need to begin to advocate for that when justice is served, but it must be seen to be done, not only by sentencing, but also by continuing to serve the sentence that is put upon the person.
Okay, now just before we quickly round up, how would you rate the literacy amongst African women as we gear up to World Literacy Day?
Yeah, all right. You'd know that in the Millennium Development Goals, one of the issues that we had to look at was the access to education, as well as literacy rates for girl children in particular. And part of that was because the literacy rate in Africa in general has tended to be very low. And you'd find that in South Africa, of course, we've finally reached parity. We talked about parity earlier, where you have, you know, as many girls entering school as you would have boys entering school, at least at a primary level. As you go higher up, you will find that girls may take on additional responsibilities and not necessarily continue, and so you might have lesser numbers. But in the South African context, you do find that more young women are entering tertiary institutions. So some progress is made within the South African context, but in terms of a continental context, different countries are making steady progress in ensuring that there are more women who can be literate and afforded an opportunity to actually develop themselves even after the years where they may not have been afforded primary education.
At all. Okay, so what are the aspirations of the 21st century woman? What does she want? Who is she?
I think she's a free woman. She's an independent woman, but she's also a woman striving for balance. Balance, and also a woman striving to say, if I choose to be a married woman and a housewife for that should be okay too. And that it's a woman who is not going to be subjected, or if she is, would certainly find her voice to not be discriminated or oppressed or put down, but will also strive to make sure that she has access to opportunities, equal access, that her participation is not only token participation, but full participation. But she's also a woman who's not going to be allowed to be asked, but how educated are you? Are you capable of leading? When the same question has not been asked of men over the years.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful conversation that we just had there. That was Nsiki, the Chief Director of the Social Department and Department of Women in South Africa. Thank you very much. Now, at the beginning of the program, I said history would tell us categorically that women in the past have been relegated to the background. But now, looking at the 21st century woman, it has been able to change the status quo. I think they deserve a standing ovation, but they have changed their life and have changed the world as a whole. If we now live in a better society today, we should congratulate women for what they have done. We must congratulate every woman we see, whether it is on the shores of Accra or on the Arabian desert of the streets of Times Square. They have reshaped the world and promoted balance. No matter the bad effect the change they have had on the continent, we must know that nothing comes at a cost. Thank you for watching. Do join me again next Thursday as we bring you more insight on the world's current and political affairs on Worldview. Good evening.